Hi everybody, this video is about Mary, Queen of Scots. Now I know that she's been mentioned in lessons previously on the Elizabethan era and religion generally. This is more of a look into her background and specifically why she was a threat to Queen Elizabeth. As you can see there on the slide, a reminder of the Tudor line of succession and the relationship between Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots. As you can see, Mary's grandmother was Princess Margaret, and Elizabeth's father is Henry VIII, who are both the children of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. So Elizabeth is the granddaughter of Henry VII, the first Tudor king. Mary, Queen of Scots, the great-granddaughter of Henry VII. On this slide, I'm briefly going to tell you about Mary's 3 marriages, none of which end happily. And again, this is another reason why Elizabeth was wary of marriage in general, because she was able to look over the sea to France and later across the border to Scotland and see that queens and their marriages didn't always end very well. So, first husband is Francis, or François le Dauphin, the French prince. She is sent to France at the age of 5 and is betrothed to Francois, the French prince, who is aged just 4. Now, I use the word betrothed there. That is essentially when 2 powerful families engage their own children to one another. It's a promise of marriage when they come of age. And sure enough, in 1558, the year that Elizabeth comes to the throne, Mary, Queen of Scots, marries Francois. In 1559, Francois's father dies. That's important for 2 reasons. Number 1, Francois's father quite cheekily announced Mary and his son as King and Queen of England, failing to recognise the claim of Elizabeth I, the Protestant ruler of Tudor England. But in 1559, when Francois's father dies, they become the rulers of France. Francis as king and Mary as queen consort. Unfortunately for Mary, her husband dies and she finds herself back in Scotland. She later marries her second husband, Lord Darnley, Henry Stuart, and you can see him there, husband number 2. Now, Lord Darnley and Mary were in fact cousins. And so Mary's return to Scotland sees her marrying her Protestant Scottish cousin, Lord Darnley. And Lord Darnley is not a very nice man, to put it in short. He's insanely jealous. He's a womanizer, and a very violent man too. So when Mary is pregnant with their first and only child, who will go on to become King James of Scotland and later King James of England too, when she's pregnant, her closest friend, or one of her closest friends, an Italian man by the name of David Rizzio, is brutally murdered, and Darnley and a gang of others that are with him are involved in that murder. And that was just a sign of Darnley's violent, jealous tendencies. There is no evidence whatsoever of Rizzio and Mary being romantically involved. In fact, many contemporary accounts actually suggest that Rizzio was in fact gay. Darnley meets quite a nasty end, and he is blown up. He's out on a trip on the outskirts of Edinburgh. He and his friend meet quite a nasty end in what is the first of many murders involving gunpowder. And in an ironic twist, Darnley's son, James, is also subject to a gunpowder plot, but that's not until the Stuart period, and you'll have to wait until A-level history to hear all about that. The scandal doesn't end there. The person implicated in the murder of Darnley is husband number 3, the Earl of Bothwell. Now, the Earl of Bothwell was again a very violent man. After Darnley's murder, one of Darnley's former soldiers comes up to Mary whilst she is walking with the Earl of Bothwell and asks if she will financially support him now that his career serving Lord Darnley is over. Bothwell beats the man so severely that he dies 2 days after as a result of the beating that he suffers. Bothwell then kidnaps Mary, and according to Mary's Privy Council, not only kidnaps her, but rapes her as well. The two return to Edinburgh and marry at Holyrood Palace. Mary is still in a period of mourning for her second husband, and so marries in a black wedding dress. Very few people actually attend the wedding, and Bothwell was one of the most hated men in Scotland. He'd actually already been put on trial for the murder of Darnley, but got off on a lack of evidence. And so the hated Bothwell became Mary's third husband. And it led to any public support that people had for Mary to disappear altogether. And what's just appeared on the screen is a poster. And the posters, like this one, appeared particularly in Edinburgh, but all over Scotland. And we can see M.R., meaning Queen Mary. Mary is shown as a mermaid. Now, in today's mythology, a mermaid is a beautiful exotic creature. But in the Stuart period, a mermaid was a metaphor for a prostitute. A mermaid in sailor stories of the period, a mermaid was something beautiful but inherently evil that would drag sailors to their death. They would tempt sailors in with their beauty and then drown them. And so to be referred to as a mermaid was to say that Mary was nothing more than a common prostitute. And underneath that, we can see the insignia, the goat, representing the Earl of Bothwell, with swords all around the outside of it. And that's pretty harsh for a woman who, whilst pregnant, watched her best friend murdered by a second husband. Then the second husband is assassinated by the third husband, who then kidnaps and rapes her, and then they end up marrying for a third time, which means that Mary's position in Scotland is impossible. She has to get away, and the only place that she knows that is safe for her is to ask for her cousin Elizabeth to take care of her in England. But when Mary arrives in England, it isn't a happy family reunion. For Elizabeth, Mary is at best an inconvenience, at worst a threat to her position on the throne. And what you've got to remember is that at the age of 5, Mary is sent off and receives a Catholic upbringing in Catholic France. And that is why the Catholic King of France declares Mary Queen of England when Mary Tudor, also a Catholic, dies. And so what Mary the Queen of Scots represents is a figurehead for Catholic rebellions against Queen Elizabeth. And this is going to be particularly true after 1570. Now remember, Mary enters England asking for refuge in 1568. In 1570, the Pope excommunicates Elizabeth, calls her the pretended Queen of England, and encourages all Catholics living under her reign to rebel against her. And so, if Mary was just an inconvenience in 1568, she is a very real threat to the throne by 1570. And so, with Mary being such a problem, Elizabeth decides to place her under house arrest. And Mary had had previous experience of escaping from house arrest. She was actually under arrest in Scotland when she charmed her keeper, sailed across the boating lake and made her escape to England. She's initially placed in Carlisle Castle in the north of England, but that is judged to be too close to the Scottish border and too close to the coast. And so they move her to Bolton Castle, not near Bolton, in North Yorkshire. She then spends a lot of time hopping from place to place. She spends a lot of her time imprisoned at Sheffield Castle and Sheffield Manor Lodge, which is our site study, which we'll be going into in a bit more detail soon. And the idea being that she needs to be far enough away from court, far away enough from Elizabeth and important people in English politics. She needs to be up north, but she also needs to be far enough away from the Scottish border and not too close to the coasts to ensure that her chances of escape are lowered. And there are many Catholics, particularly in England, who are willing to risk their lives or their freedom to get Mary out of house arrest. I'm now going to go through the main rebellions that Mary's arrival in England led to in Elizabeth's reign. And the notes are actually taken from your version of the textbook. So the first rebellion is the Northern Rebellion of 1569. You can find this on pages 73 to 74 of your textbook. And the brains behind this rebellion is the Duke of Norfolk, Elizabeth's cousin. Now, he does not want to replace Elizabeth on the throne with Mary. What he wants to do is marry Mary and ensure through their family connections, Norfolk on one side of the family, Mary from the other, that two cousins in Elizabeth's family would get married and therefore they would take the throne when Elizabeth died. And this was all part of the politics of Elizabethan England. Norfolk was a rival of William Cecil, who we've looked at in the Privy Council. He was frustrated that Cecil was the Queen's key advisor, and he decided that this rebellion would help strengthen his position. Now, initially, Robert Dudley, because he's also a rival to Cecil, supports what Norfolk has planned. But he changes his mind and he confesses to Elizabeth what Norfolk is planning. When Elizabeth and the court finds out, Norfolk flees. He's captured and imprisoned, and Norfolk begs for forgiveness. Now, he had said to any potential rebels not to go out with, to carry on with this plot. However, Elizabeth's decision to call the Earl of Northumberland and the Earl of Westmoreland to court to explain their role in the plot doesn't help the situation, because they're both Catholics, and when she called them to come to court to explain themselves, the two earls then led the rebellion on the Duke of Norfolk's behalf. So they illegally hear Mass in Durham Cathedral in November, and then they head south to the east of the Pennines. So we're looking at North and East Yorkshire. And Elizabeth's army of the north are struggling to put the rebels down. The rebels capture Barnard Castle, which is up in the northeast. And those of you who keep up to date with politics will know that Barnard Castle during the COVID years was very much in the newspapers. But that's a different story. Now, these rebel earls, Westmoreland and Northumberland, are hoping for help from Catholic Spain because the Spanish ambassador had promised that he would support them. But that help never appears. The Spanish don't really like Mary, Queen of Scots, not because she's a Catholic, but because she was pro-French. And although Spain and France were both Catholic countries, they were political rivals in Europe. They both wanted to be and considered themselves to be the most important Catholic country in Europe. So, the reason why it collapses is the fact that the Spanish don't turn up in support of the rebellion. And you've got to remember as well that the Pope hasn't yet excommunicated Elizabeth. It's a year before the Pope does that. And until that sort of notice of open rebellion is announced, most Catholics actually stay loyal to Elizabeth and don't join in. Eventually, Elizabeth's forces sort of take the upper hand and they drive the rebels way up into past the northeast and over into the Scottish border. And when the rebellion collapses, 450 rebels are executed. Westmoreland escaped abroad. Northumberland was betrayed by a Scottish plan, betrayed by a Scottish clan, is handed to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth orders his execution. And Norfolk, who has been imprisoned and captured, is also his head's also on the chopping block, and the Privy Council are trying to persuade Elizabeth to execute him, but out of family loyalty, she spares his life. And in 1570, he's released from the Tower of London. And the second plot is the Ridolfi plot of 1571. Now, the date is important because this is after the Pope's message to English Catholics that they should be in open rebellion to Queen Elizabeth. So, after the Pope excommunicates Elizabeth, Roberto di Ridolfi, who is an Italian Catholic living in London, decides to take it upon himself to inspire the rebellion that the Pope has asked for. And it involves Mary Queen of Scots, it involves the Spanish, and it again involves the Duke of Norfolk. So the plan is that Elizabeth would be assassinated and replaced with Mary on the throne. And the idea was that Spanish troops, again, are supposedly coming over to England to support the rebellion. Duke of Norfolk would marry Mary under Di Ridolfi's plan. And remember that Norfolk's only just been out of prison for, less than a year at this point. And he hasn't given up his hopes of a powerful political career. And Mary, in 1571, she's now been in prison for over 3 years, and she's beginning to feel a sense of helplessness, and she reluctantly agrees to the plot as well. Now, Elizabeth has a network of spies led by Sir Francis Walsingham, who we looked at when we covered the Privy Council. And Elizabeth's spies discover the conspiracy. Fortunately for Ridolfi, he wasn't in England at the time that the plot was discovered, and so he escapes prosecution. The Spanish ambassador is expelled from England for his role in supporting the rebellion, and Norfolk is arrested and found guilty of treason. She refused to sign his death warrant after the Northern Rebellion, but this time she agrees with Parliament and signs his death warrant, and he is executed a year later in 1572. There's also pressure from the Privy Council and Parliament to execute Mary, but she absolutely refuses to even consider this. Now, Parliament did pass a law, and it doesn't mention Mary by name, but it's absolutely directed at her. The law states that anyone who has a claim to the throne and knows of a plan to assassinate the reigning monarch should be removed from the line of succession. So although Mary isn't named in that law, it's very much directed at her and trying to stop her from taking the throne. But what comes of the Ridolfi plot is a few things. First of all, the chances of an open Catholic rebellion are higher because the Pope has excommunicated Elizabeth. It leads to the execution of the Norfolk, who escaped execution the first time round. And it also means that Parliament and the Privy Council are both trying to put pressure on Elizabeth now to deal with Mary once and for all. Plot number 3 is the Throckmorton plot of 1583. Now, Throckmorton was essentially the go-between. Francis Throckmorton, he passed messages between Mary and the Spanish ambassador, the replacement of the last one, a man by the name of Bernardino de Mendoza. So, here's the plan. Yet again, the plot is to assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary from house arrest, and place her on the throne. And you can realise that now, by 1583, Mary is desperate. She's been under house arrest now for 15 years, and she feels as though she's going to die, kept in these castles and stately homes around England, and she's becoming increasingly desperate. So the plan is murder Elizabeth, place Mary on the throne. But we mentioned before, Francis Walsingham, this team of spies, again uncover the plot. And rather than take the evidence straight to Elizabeth, what Walsingham does is he follows Throckmorton for 6 months. They eventually put him under surveillance. He's then arrested tortured on the rack, which was an excruciating device where a person's hands and legs were tied to the end of a large table, and then the rack would quite literally stretch them. It would lead to excruciating bones breaking and dislocations of joints. And he admitted to it all. He made a full confession. Now, the key thing from this, first of all, Throckmorton's convicted of treason and is executed. The Spanish ambassador, once more, is kicked out of England, and no more Spanish ambassadors for the rest of Elizabeth's reign will be invited to stay in England. Mary gets away with it, again because of a lack of evidence of her involvement in the plot. So we've got another example of a Catholic rebel who is executed, but Mary, because of her sort of half involvement in it, avoids facing a trial. What it does do, though, is it makes Francis Walsingham absolutely convinced that Mary's up to something, and he becomes determined to find her guilty of a treasonous plot against the Queen. Now, the bond of association had been passed after this plot as well, which meant that anyone who was involved in an assassination plot against Elizabeth wouldn't be able to benefit from the Queen's death in any way. So the bond of association was designed so that if Elizabeth was to die after an assassination attempt and Mary was involved in it, then she would not be able to take the throne whatsoever. And the final plot is the Babington plot. Now, the person pictured there isn't Babington at all. It's actually Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spy master, who discovers the plot. So after 1583 and the Throckmorton plot, Mary's moved twice, first to Tutbury Castle and then to Chartley Hall. And by this point, all of Mary's comforts have been taken away. She can't have any visitors, any of her letters are checked, and she feels absolutely trapped. And the person in charge of her as her jailer was a strict Puritan and a hater of Catholics and the Catholic faith. So Elizabeth and the Privy Council deliberately choose uncomfortable conditions for Mary. But for Walsingham, it's not just to make her life difficult, but also to push her into plotting against the Queen again. And Mary falls into that trap. She'd now been imprisoned for almost 20 years of her life. Remember that when she first came to England, her hope was that her cousin, who she in her letters referred to as a sister, she hoped that she would find refuge in England and she'd be taken care of. And what actually happened in the end is that she spent 20 years in prison, and by this point, 1586, she was cut off from the rest of the world and had nothing for her. She hadn't seen or heard from her son, and she'd lost all hope. So by this point, an older and desperately sort of emotionally and mentally unwell Mary involves herself in the final plot. So she begins sending these coded letters, and source 8 below shows you the code that was used. And she's sending letters to the French ambassador, but also to a Catholic in Derbyshire by the name of Sir Anthony Babington. And he'd been recruited by a Jesuit priest, and his plan was to organise a new plot against the Queen. And so these letters, these coded letters, are being smuggled in and out of Chartley Hall, and they are intercepted. And again, the plan is kill Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne, re-establish Catholicism with the help of a Spanish invasion force. It's the same idea as we saw with the Ridolfi plot, the same idea as we saw with the Throckmorton plot: kill Elizabeth, put Mary on the throne, and bring Catholicism back. But as I've suggested before, Walsingham knew all about it, and one of the supposed sympathisers to Mary at Chartley Hall was a double agent, a Protestant by the name of Gilbert Gifford. He intercepted the letters were then decoded and sent to Walsingham. And so What Walsingham does, even though he's decoding the letters, is he allows the letters to be sent and allows the plot to unfold deeper and deeper in the hope of implicating Mary. Because in the previous plots, Mary has had just enough deniability to suggest that she wasn't playing an active role in the plot. What Walsingham does now is he waits for definitive evidence. And in July 1586, Mary sends a coded letter in which it includes the phrase, "set the men to work." And it is that phrase that Walsingham uses as evidence to prove to Elizabeth that Mary is involved and willing in this plot to murder her. In August of 1586, Babington's arrested. In September, he and his fellow conspirators are hung, drawn and quartered, which is traditionally a traitor's death. And so, because of Mary's guilt, that phrase "set the men to work," in October, Mary is placed on trial at Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire, and you can see an illustration of the trial on the left-hand side. Now, Mary makes her own defence, and you can see that in the image on the right. Mary stands up and produces her own case of the defence, which she does so very well, and she does so eloquently. However, it's not enough to convince a jury that she isn't guilty of treason, and she's found guilty. Parliament and the Privy Council are putting strong pressure on Elizabeth to execute her cousin. Now, this is a problem, because Elizabeth knows that these plots aren't going to go away for as long as Mary is alive. But she knows that if she signs the death warrant, she will be ordering the execution of a queen. And that's a very dangerous thing to do, particularly when that queen, Mary Queen of Scots, has the support of the most powerful nation in Europe, which is Spain. So, Elizabeth dithers. She doesn't know what to do. She resists pressure to sign a death warrant in the first case. And when Cecil produces one at the end of 1586, in December, Elizabeth refuses to sign it. In February of 1587, Elizabeth does sign the death warrant, and that's because there are rumours that a Spanish force is going to land in Wales in support of Mary. And so Elizabeth says that the death warrant should not be sealed, should not be given the royal seal, that should the death of Mary, the execution of Mary be needed, she's already signed it and all it needs is the royal seal. However, the Privy Council meets without Elizabeth's knowledge, and they take the drastic decision to ignore the Queen's instruction, seal the death warrant and send it to Mary's place of imprisonment, which is Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire. And on the 8th of February 1587, in what proves to be quite a difficult execution for Mary, it takes quite a lot of attempts to remove a head from her shoulders. Mary, Queen of Scots, is eventually beheaded. Now, apparently Elizabeth is furious at this decision. She's appalled at the idea that the Privy Council have ignored her instructions, and it doesn't reflect well on her that it seems as though she's given permission for the murder of a family member and a fellow monarch, and to kill a monarch is regicide, and it's one of the highest crimes one can commit. She banishes Cecil, her closest advisor, and refuses to see him for another 6 months, and she imprisons her own secretary in the Tower of London. And what Elizabeth had inadvertently done in signing the death warrant is she'd created a martyr for English Catholics. Mary now represented the desperate cause of Catholicism in England, and her death just led to more opposition against Elizabeth and the Protestant faith. But English Catholics don't rise up in protest against her. And Elizabeth and Walsingham are pretty surprised at that. And it seems as though Catholics are more loyal to the Queen than they might have feared. outside of England, there was uproar. The King of Scotland, James VI, had heard news of his mother's execution and wrote to Elizabeth asking for an explanation. Her brother-in-law, the King of France, protested the execution as well. And Philip II of Spain, a nation that England was already at war with, was incensed by the execution of who they believed to be the rightful heir to the English throne. Elizabeth claimed innocence in the whole affair, and she blamed secretaries and people like Cecil for not following her instructions. Some historians have challenged that. They've suggested that Elizabeth signed it in a moment of desperation and later went on to regret it, and that her secretaries provided a scapegoat for that. But we'll never truly know whether or not Elizabeth intended on that execution to take place or not.